So what I want to do here in this section is to kind of use some data that we've collected around what current practices are and use those then to illustrate our point of view about what best practices are. So you can get a kind of a view of, well, this is what organizations typically do, and here are some ways to think about it, and here's what a best practice might look like in that particular area. So I'm going to have some pretty clear if you will, points of view and conclusions around how best to each sort of design decision that you're going to have to do designing any 360 program. So the first, and again, people often overlook this, but step back for a minute before you start. Ask yourself, why are we doing this? What's the purpose? What would success look like? I think getting clarity around this, a lot of times HR leaders will get kind of the task of, go do a 360, we need a 360 process. If you stop and ask, okay, what are we trying to accomplish with our 360 process? And you make sure you hear that from multiple different business leaders, you're going to have the greatest chance of success, because you can design a 360 process to accomplish many different needs, as we saw in the different ways that 360s are implemented. But if you are clear on those goals up front, those bigger, broader goals, it will help you with each of those design decisions. So let's take a look at what some of those design decisions are. One of the interesting things is that when you start, it seems simple. Start a 360 process, 360, collect the surveys, generate reports, maybe we give some follow-up coaching, get some action plans in place, we're good to go. Sounds great, but when you start thinking about the process, all of a sudden, this seemingly simple steps, you get lots of complicated questions kind of popping up, and one question leads to another. So something as simple as who should receive the report can radically change the outcome in a 360 process. So let's just take that as an example, and we're going to go through most, if not all, of these questions and look at kind of the current practices and then some advice about how to address and do each of these questions. But let me just illustrate for one question what it might look like. So if you think about who should receive the report. So if I'm filling out a survey about one of my colleagues, and I know that only they are going to get their report, nobody else, I know this is really just for their benefit, and so I'm going to be perhaps a little more forthright. My responses are going to be anonymous. I've been assured of that in the orientation. So I'm going to be a little more forthright because I'm doing this in order to benefit them. On the other hand, I know that report, let's say, is only going to go to their boss, and they will not see it. Now, my rating of that individual on, say, the item follows through on commitments might change because I'm communicating to the boss what I see with that individual, and purpose for that may or may not have to do with helping that individual improve. And so just thinking through who receives the report can make a big difference in terms of what the data look like. And so you have to be clear about communicating out to individuals, well, first of all, deciding who's going to get the report and why, and what should they do with it. But then also communicating out to individuals completing the survey so they know who's getting the report and therefore what's the purpose of this. So thinking through these decisions is critical. So let's take a look at some of those. I will say that what I'm going to present is pretty research-based. I mentioned in part one that we approach all work we do from a very strong research base. When I say that, it's not that just that we're aware of others' research. We have a whole bunch of our own research. So we've taken, I'm not going to go through any of these in detail, of course, but just to illustrate that we have a whole bunch of studies that we've done that address many of these different questions. Everything from what should the risk scale be to, are these competencies all lining up the way they're supposed to, et cetera. There's a huge array of questions that can get answered in a very research-based way to then guide those decisions. In this case, what we're going to be doing is looking at a particular study that we did, which was a benchmarking study. So we asked over 200 companies, less than 5% of which were our own clients, what do you do when you approach each of these different design decisions? 22 different design decisions, everything from should we customize the survey, should we provide coaching, all the way through the gamut. Basically, we looked at this from the perspective of if I was designing a 360 program, what are the kinds of design questions I would have to answer for myself in implementing it, and let's find out what the companies do in kind of a standard way, and see if we can get some trends. The other thing about this is that we're often asked from clients, well, gee, what do people typically do? And so our thought process is let's not just put out our point of view from our clients that are going to be biased toward our perspective. Let's find out kind of across lots of different industries and organizations what they typically do. So what I'm going to do as I go through here is I'm going to raise one of those design questions. I'm going to illustrate what our point of view is about what best practice is, and then I'm going to share some of the data and talk a little bit about each one. So let's look at the first one. I talked about usage. So you've got to be clear about what you're using it for. One of the worst things that can happen as an HR executive is you do a 360 process, you get a bunch of data, and then you have an executive walk in and say, hey, I need to see everybody's report so that I can figure out how to reorganize the organization. And you're sitting there going, we didn't tell anyone we were going to use the data this way. We told them it was just going to be their report, and what do you mean? So being clear up front is really, really critical. In this case, if you look at the way organizations have used it, this gets back to the question, that kind of that dichotomy or the continuum. You can see that primarily organizations use 360s sort of from a development-oriented standpoint. So the career development in general, performance management is still there and not a trivial issue in terms of how people are using it. But it's clearly development is kind of that key component. When you get down into things like using 360 to decide who's going to get a pay increase or not, it's very, very rarely done. And I would say that using it in those ways needs to be done with great caution. Again, you just want to make sure you've got really accurate, clear data and that the usage is communicated. And that's the real message here, is that you can decide to use 360 in a lot of different ways. The main thing is that you want to be clear for yourself, for your constituents, and for the people who are participating, how is it going to be used? If you've got clarity and transparency around that, then your design decisions become much easier. So another key element, I talked previously about this idea of tailoring to the process and tailoring the process to the level. So if you know that you're really just working at the executive level with vice presidents, your process is going to look a lot differently than if you're working just with individual contributors who are all sort of team-based without a kind of hierarchical level of differences. So when we look at organizations, so again, the same point of view, right? How many people are working with mostly mid-level managers versus executive versus individual contributors? The data sort of fall out this way, that managers, kind of that manager level, is probably the most common. Executives as well. So really it tends to be sort of a leadership-intensive space. Individual contributors, 15%, that's not a real number, but still it tends to be less commonly used for individual contributors, more so for leaders. And in a few organizations, really all employees, which is a pretty extensive, elaborate process. It's leading to be a lot less kind of hands-on. Although occasionally you'll see those be sort of a process where the 360 is available to anybody. But one thing I will point out is that if you don't tailor your process to each of these levels, particularly just think about the content. If you use the same survey questions for individual contributors that you use for vice presidents, it's going to be pretty watered down. So I would encourage you to think about the different levels, and I really would in this kind of color coding scheme, think about it as kind of executive level, management level, and then individual contributor level, and that each of those has a very different process. Very common for our clients to have 3 or in some cases even 4 different surveys based typically on level, in some cases job function when that's appropriate, but typically on level. So really thinking about your audience is important in designing it, and don't feel you need the same process for each of these different levels, because it can often differ quite a bit. Another element that's important to think about is the idea of the content, the survey content itself, and really using that as an aspirational focus. And I've talked in other webinars about this notion that the 360 can help push leaders and individuals forward in what you expect and really link to strategy. So recognizing that if you're identifying behaviors that you want leaders to exhibit, to exemplify your culture, to exemplify where your strategy is headed, that's a way that you can leverage 360s really for the value for the organization in terms of helping them move forward. So you take, for example, 2 different survey items: seeks opportunities for process improvements or makes transformational changes to benefit the business. If you choose one of these items over the other, it's going to make a big difference in the message that you're giving leaders about what's expected of them and what you're looking to do within the organization. Are you looking for leaders to constantly be tweaking and improving, or are you really looking for them to radically disrupt what's going on in the organization and change where they're headed? Both of these would load into an innovation competency, but you can see that the content itself just changes radically how you're pushing your leaders and what you're asking them to do. We talk a lot about making survey content relevant. So you want to make sure that it's relevant to the audience. So it could be something as simple as organization. So when we work with a university, we don't have an item called makes customers a top priority. We shift it to make students a top priority. Same thing with healthcare, makes patients a top priority. Relevance is really critical to the credibility, and this goes right back to that notion of acceptance that we were talking about in part 1. It could be by job domain, so you may, if you've got an R&D focused project, an R&D department, you might want people following procedures to assure quality. In a sales department, it's more about acts with a sense of urgency. The interesting point here is that if you tried using the first one, follows procedure to assure quality, that might be problematic in a sales department where procedure is slowing them down, and likewise R&D might be a little confused by this idea of sense of urgency because their focus is on quality. So you may want to think a little bit about that job domain, and then of course we talked about job level already in terms of whether you're working with someone who's an individual contributor or a manager. So think through the content and make sure that content fits not just the organization, not just the job domain, but also the job level. One of the things we run into quite frequently is clients who feel they can write their own survey items, and we've got some pretty long, deep expertise in psychometrics around how you build an effective survey. And there's some things like don't ask 3 questions in one because the person rating it won't understand it, how to rate it accurately, and the person getting the feedback won't understand which of those 3 things they actually need to develop. You'd be surprised how often we see items like that. So trying to write really simple, clear behavioral items is absolutely critical. So they look easy. CEOs are notorious for writing incredibly complicated, very flowery language that sounds wonderful but not psychometrically sound items. So what we find is that this notion of customization is very common. There's about 1/5 of the organizations that do use surveys just right off the shelf. Customizing, it tends to be the norm. So the interesting thing, so here we've got 80% doing some customization or not, or another. The interesting thing here with this content is that there's an expert involved in some level of almost all of these. So if you look at each of these different customization elements, there's a consultant involved, an internal expert of some kind. 1/3 of them may not be, but really. You need someone at least at those items to make sure the factor structures and such are going to come out well, and they're not only going to be rated accurately, but they'll be interpretable. People often ask, how long should the survey be? We've seen them as short as 10 and as long as 150. What we would say is 70 or less is pretty ideal. You can do 70 questions if they're written well in under 10 minutes. Quite easily. So that's a pretty good guide. If you look at the data that are out there, that's pretty common. So virtually all surveys are less than 70, and that's a reasonable metric. There's a trend in the direction of shorter surveys, but I would be cautious that there's a point at which you could make them so short that you lose a whole bunch of the areas they need to focus on. And again, if you think about the fact that you can do a 70-question survey in about 8 minutes, it's not a bunch to ask, and it creates a more kind of comprehensive assessment of that leader and some more valuable feedback. Now, our point of view here is that listing respondent names in the report is quite important. This has perhaps a bit controversial. People worry somehow that having a list of names, just a list of names of people that responded in the report, problematic from an anonymity standpoint. The reality is that if you know that 5 of your 7 direct reports filled the survey out, but you don't know which 2 didn't, it can be very difficult to interpret those data. Let's say the two superstars in your group didn't fill that survey out, and you don't know that, and you're assuming that the results represent their point of view. You may really change your behavior a little differently based on who those individuals are. So in terms of interpreting accurately what the data are in the report, knowing who provided the data is quite important. You're still well protected in terms of anonymity, but I think it's quite critical to at least understand, to be interpreting the data accurately, you need to know where the data came from at a broad level. So when you think about kind of who's choosing those raters and what's typically done out there, we find that there's quite a few, the typical process is going to be, or the most common process is going to be the participant choosing their own raters, and then probably with some kind of approval, either HR or their manager going in and making sure, oh, okay, you didn't pick the friends and family plan. I think the key in both of those elements of kind of how you choose the raters and where they end up in the report is that you want to make sure it's visible, it's clear, that there isn't some sort of hidden element. We worked with one organization actually that literally didn't want the participant in any way to know who it was that filled the survey out, and coaching them was challenging. They literally didn't get they didn't know anything about the process until they got the report, and they're looking at it and they're saying, okay, so I've got this low score on this thing, but I don't know who filled it out. Is this credible? Is this believable? Who should I work with? Should I follow up more with? Very challenging to get to any kind of authentic action and change in that environment. A common sort of, I guess if there's one sort of principle that you want to stick to in all 360 processes, it's this notion that transparency builds trust. So being transparent about the process, about how the data are going to be used, is just critical for building trust and getting that component in our definition from part 1 around honest feedback, right? If you want honest feedback from people, they need to trust the process, and they're going to trust it if the process itself is transparency. So something as simple as who receives a copy of the report, and knowing that, as I used the example before, is going to make a big difference in the way people provide their ratings. So we found some interesting trends here in terms of who receives the report. I was a little concerned, frankly, when I saw the data in that 22% of organizations don't give it to the participant. A little strange. But I would say that best practice is really to give that participant the report, and then again, transparency. Be clear about who else has a copy of it. There's no right or wrong about should HR or shouldn't HR, but be clear so that everyone knows HR has a copy of the report and you have a copy of the report. Your boss has a copy of the report, and you have a copy of the report. As long as you're clear about it, you're going to be fine. But if you aren't clear and someone finds out, oh, my boss has a copy, I didn't think that was going to happen, now all of a sudden trust the process disappears, participation is going to wane, and you're losing the opportunity to use the process to benefit the organization. Okay, a couple more here. So one thing to recognize, again, we talked about that continuum in the earlier section. So development needs to come first. Fundamentally, 360, there ought to be a developmental component to each piece. What we find is that organizations use 360s for a wide range of purposes, some of which are development and some of which aren't. Again, the big debate here is, should it be for development? Shouldn't it be? It looks like a little over a third really just use 360s for self-development decisions only. And so whereas I wouldn't necessarily advocate that as the only use, I think it is important to recognize that each one of these elements does have some development component, and you need to be true to that development piece. You can see here only 2% report using it for personnel decisions specifically, and that can be a little problematic. So I would say that regardless of how much kind of decision making is in your process, you want to make sure there is some development, and that the process is designed around that development piece. That needs to be kind of a component, critical component. Lastly, I would contend from a best practice standpoint, coaching, some kind of follow-up support, and people, whether it's sort of literally long-term coaching or just that 1-hour debrief around the report from somebody who can help the person getting the report figure out, how do I get to some sort of change here. How do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of this from a what do I do differently standpoint? That's really, really critical. So we ask people, well, what kind of support is available? And indeed, coaching, support from the manager, these are very, over 2/3 of the organizations are providing that, some element of support that way. A lot of different other methods that can be used. You can, do a live training workshop, multiple people in the same room, but some sort of follow-up. Again, just that desk drop approach is not going to be particularly effective. Okay, and then lastly, we were asked back in the 90s, gee, is 360 feedback a trend, or is it waning, is it gaining? What we found is that really 360s are kind of here to stay. People see them as expanding in uses. They're not their own program. They're tools that can be used in multiple programs, and for that reason, people continue to find new and better ways of using 360s. The big message, though, is that while they continue to grow, be thoughtful about the process, the method that you're using, the purpose that you have for them, and be clear and transparent about those decisions that you've made so that the use that you're hoping for it is going to actually work the way you want it to look. So anyway, those are some best practices, some perspectives from the field in terms of what people typically do. I've got a couple more minutes now. Let me see if I've got any questions about data, our point of view, or any of the other elements that I touched on.
Hi, Dale. Yeah, we do have a couple of great questions. So someone asked, with all the different tools out there, how you would differentiate 360s from self-report measures like a personality test or a cognitive ability test, and also non-self-report measures like an interview with coworkers or performance evaluation.
Yeah, so a lot in there, but simply, I guess what I would say is from a self-report standpoint, personality, cognitive ability, that kind of thing, you're really limited to one perspective. You're limited in terms of what you're seeing, and it's a more of an inward look than an outward look. And what we find is that effectiveness as leaders and as coworkers involves much more around that outward look. So I think there's just sort of a different perspective there in terms of what you're valuing and the interactive aspect of it. It's difficult to go to your direct reports and say, hey, my personality test said that I'm an extrovert, so here's what I'm doing different. So it's not that you can't use the personality measures. We do that quite frequently in our coaching, but we blend it with a 360 to understand that external environment. And then in terms of other non-self-report measures, assessment centers, that kind of stuff, I think 360s tend to be a little, the sweet spot there is they're a little bit more cost effective because they can be done a little bit more efficiently. So there's some benefits there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I know you mentioned listing respondent names in the report, and someone wanted to know, would you link these names to actual scores, just provide a list of names?
Right, yeah, no, great point. I definitely would not ever link responses to names specifically, but I think in the front of the report or the back, just a list of these are the people who were in your peer group. These are the people who were in your direct report group, and then you look at that average or the distribution separately of the direct reports or the peers, and you understand, oh, okay, these 3 peers didn't even reply. Now I understand what these data are telling me versus a different set of peers. So it's really the list at the front. Yeah, you got to be careful about anonymity that way. And of course, there's always the minimum of 3. You would never report data unless there were at least 3 respondents to protect the anonymity as well.
Okay, great. And we had one additional question about rater selection. Mara wanted to know what would be the advantages or disadvantages of different approaches to rater selection and why you wouldn't just let the leader select the raters.
Yeah, so some of this goes a little bit to culture in your organization. Particularly early on, you may find people, one of the things I see is if I work with a leader and the first time they get a 360, they might kind of, if they don't have an approval process built in, they might do sort of the friends and family plan. They're going to stack the deck in their favor with people who kind of like them. And then they get the report and they get very disappointed because they realize, oh, these are all really high scores, but I stacked the deck, and what's really going on out there? And so I think one of the advantages of an approval process is it helps people get more quickly to that. Usually the second time I work with a leader, they go either the other way or they get a more balanced group because they realize that the first report was a little bit, didn't feel feel as authentic. So often there's a leveling out, but I think there's some benefits to approval. The one key, though, is you have to be careful not to go too far the other way. You want people to own the feedback themselves. You want them to have buy-in for who provided their feedback. It's important that it's credible. So if they feel that the wrong people were chosen and they don't believe the data, then you're not going to get that change. So it's kind of a balance, and it has a little bit to do with the culture of the organization and their experience with feedback. I think, generally, all other things being equal, participant choosing and then having an approval process, ideally with the boss, so that the boss is involved early on. The boss needs to be involved in this stuff. It's about development, and career development. So ideally, all other things being equal, I'd have the participant choose and then have the boss approve.
Okay, that looks like all the time we have for today. But thank you all for your thoughtful questions. If you have additional questions that didn't get addressed here, please feel free to reach out to us by phone at 510-463-0333, and please visit our website. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.